Hello, and welcome to Cracking the AP Environmental Science Exam 2018 edition, Chapter 5, The Inhabitants of Planet Earth and Their Relationships. According to the College Board, about 10 to 15% of the questions you'll see on the AP Environmental Science exam can be classified under the broad topic, the living world. In this chapter, we'll cover everything you'll need to know to tackle these questions. As you probably learned in your biology class, the non-living components of Earth are known as its abiotic components. These include the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere. The things we studied in the last chapter. In this chapter, we'll talk about the biotic or living components of Earth. We'll start by discussing elements that bridge the gap between the non-living and the living: water, nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus, and how they cycle through the environment. We'll then move on to a discussion of what types of ecosystems exist and how they're structured. We'll continue our review by discussing how energy flows through ecosystems, and we'll end the chapter with a review of how ecosystems change. Let's begin. As you may have learned in your biology class, nutrients such as carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and water all move through the environment in complex cycles known as biogeochemical cycles. Well, you'll need to know a bit about these cycles for the exam, so we'll go through each of them here. As you can probably tell from the collective name of these natural cycles, living organisms, geological formations, and chemical substances are all involved in these cycles. Keep in mind that when we describe the movement of these inorganic compounds, it's important to understand both the destination of the compounds and how they move toward their destination. In other words, you'll need to know that water moves from the atmosphere to Earth's surface through precipitation, either in the form of snow or rainfall. But let's talk about a few things that all of these cycles have in common before we go into each one in detail. First of all, the term reservoir is used to describe a place where a large quantity of nutrient it sits for long periods of time. In the water cycle, the ocean is an example of a reservoir. The opposite of a reservoir is an exchange pool, which is a site where a nutrient sits for only a short period of time. In the water cycle, a cloud is an example of an exchange pool. The amount of time a nutrient spends in a reservoir or an exchange pool is called its residency time. In the water cycle, water might exist in the form of a cloud for a few days, but it might exist as part of the ocean for 1,000 years. Perhaps surprisingly, living organisms can also serve as exchange pools and reservoirs for certain nutrients. We'll delve into more about this later. The energy that drives these biogeochemicals cycles in the biosphere comes primarily from two sources: the sun and the heat from the mantle and the core of the earth. The movement of nutrients in all of these cycles may occur via abiotic mechanisms such as winds, and may occur through biotic mechanisms such as through living organisms, as we mentioned earlier. Another important fact to note is that while the law of conservation of matter states that matter cannot be created or destroyed, nutrients can be rendered unavailable for cycling through certain processes. For example, in some cycles, nutrients may be transported to deep ocean sediments where they are locked away interminably. Though we won't get into a discussion of trace elements here, you should also know that certain trace elements such as zinc, copper, and iron are necessary in small amounts for living organisms. Trace elements can cycle in conjunction with the major nutrients, but there's still not much to be discovered about these elements and their biogeochemical cycles. For this exam, just know that there are certain trace elements required by living things that cycle, along with the major elements through the biosphere. Let's start with perhaps the best known biogeochemical cycle, the water cycle. The water cycle. As you might imagine, the water that exists in the atmosphere is in a gaseous state, and when it condenses from the gaseous state to form a liquid or solid, it becomes dense enough to fall to the earth because of the pull of gravity. This process is formally known as precipitation. When precipitation falls onto the earth, it may infiltrate the surface and percolate through the sediments until it reaches the water table to become groundwater, or it may travel across the land surface as runoff and enter a drainage system, such as a stream or river, which will eventually deposit it into a body of water such as a lake or an ocean. Lakes and oceans are reservoirs for water. In certain cold regions of Earth, water may also be trapped on Earth's surface as snow or ice. In these areas, the blocks of snow or ice are reservoirs. Water is also cycled through living systems. For example, plants consume water and carbon dioxide in the process of photosynthesis, in which they produce carbohydrates. Because all living organisms are primarily made up of water, they act as exchange pools for water. Water is returned to the atmosphere from both Earth's surface and from living organisms in a process called evaporation. Specifically, animals respire and release water vapor and additional gases to the atmosphere. In fact, the process of transpiration releases large amounts of water into the air. Finally, other major contributors to atmospheric waters are the vast number of lakes and oceans on Earth's surface. Incredibly large amounts of water continually evaporate from their surfaces. Take a look at the following graphic, which shows all the forms that water takes in the biosphere and atmosphere. The carbon cycle. Now let's talk about the carbon cycle. Let's talk about carbon, excuse me. The key events in the carbon cycle are respiration, in which animals and plants breathe in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide, and photosynthesis, in which plants take in carbon dioxide, water, and energy from the sun to produce carbohydrates. In other words, living organisms act as exchange pools for carbon. When plants are eaten by animal consumers, the carbon locked in the plant's carbohydrates passes to other organisms and continues through the food chain. More on this later in chapter. In turn, when organisms, both plants and animals, die, their bodies are decomposed through the actions of bacteria and fungi in the soil. This releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. One aspect of the carbon cycle that you should definitely be familiar with for the exam is this. When the bodies of once living organisms are buried and subjected to conditions of extreme heat and extreme pressure, this organic matter eventually becomes oil, coal, and gas. Oil, coal, and natural gas are collectively known as fossil fuels. And when fossil fuels are burned or combusted, carbon is released into the atmosphere. Finally, carbon is also released into the atmosphere through volcanic action. There are three major reservoirs of carbon. The first is the world's oceans. Because CO2 is very soluble in water, the second large reservoir of CO2 is Earth's rocks. Many types of rocks, called carbonate rocks, contain carbon in the form of calcium carbonate. Finally, fossil fuels are a huge reservoir of carbon as well. The nitrogen cycle. Earth's atmosphere is made up of approximately 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. The other components of the atmosphere are trace elements. Nitrogen is the most abundant element in the atmosphere. For this reason, it might not seem like living organisms would find it difficult to get nitrogen they need in order to live, but it is. This is because atmospheric nitrogen to second substrate, no. Alright, N2, that's what I'm going to leave it at, is not in a form that can be used directly by most organisms. In order to keep this rather complicated cycle straight, let's take a look at it in steps. Sorry, I'm tired. Step 1. Nitrogen fixation. In order to be used by most living organisms, nitrogen must be present in the form of ammonia, NH3, or nitrates, NO3 negative. Atmospheric nitrogen can be converted into these forms or fixed by atmospheric effects such as lightning storms, but most nitrogen fixation is the result of the actions of certain soil bacteria. Fixing is the process that allows nitrogen to be made biologically available, much as photosynthesis makes carbon biologically available. One important soil bacteria that participates in nitrogen fixation is rhizobium. These nitrogen-fixing bacteria are often associated with the roots of legumes such as beans or clovers. In the future, we may be able to insert the genes for nitrogen fixation into crop plants such as corn and reduce the amount of fertilization fertilizer that is used. Nitrification. In this process, soil bacteria converts ammonia or ammonium into nitrates, and then to one of the forms that can be used by plants, nitrate. Assimilation. In assimilation, plants absorb ammonia ions, and nitrate ions through the roots, heterotrophs, or organisms that receive energy by consuming other organisms, then obtain nitrogen when they consume plant proteins and nucleic acids. Ammonification. In this process, decomposing bacteria converts dead organisms and other waste to ammonia, or ammonium ions, which can be reused by plants. Denitrification. In denitrification, specialized bacteria, mostly anaerobic bacteria, convert ammonia back into nitrites and nitrates, and then into nitrogen gas and nitrous oxide gas. This gas then rises to the atmosphere. The phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus cycle is perhaps the simplest biogeochemical cycle, mostly because phosphorus does not exist in the atmosphere outside of dust particles. Phosphorus is necessary for living organisms because it is a major component of nucleic acids, ATP, cell membranes, and other important biological molecules. One important idea for you to remember about the phosphorus cycle is that phosphorus cycles are more local than those of the other important biological compounds. For the most part, phosphorus is found in soil, rocks, and sediments. It is released from these rocks forms through the process of chemical weathering. Phosphorus is usually released in the form of phosphate, which is soluble and can be absorbed from the soil by plants. A fungus called mycorrhizae found in the soil help plants absorb phosphate. You should also know that phosphorus is often a limiting factor, any factor that controls the population growth, food space, water, for plant growth, so plants that have little phosphorus are stunted. Phosphates that enter the water table and travel to the oceans can eventually be incorporated into rocks in the ocean floor. Through geologic process, ocean mixing and upwelling, these rocks from the seafloor may rise up so that their compounds once again enter the terrestrial system. Take a look at the phosphorus cycle shown in the diagram below. Humans have affected the phosphorus cycle by mining phosphorus-rich rocks in order to produce fertilizers. The fertilizers placed on fields can easily leach into the groundwater and find their way into the aquatic ecosystems, where they can cause eutrophication. Eutrophication occurs when a body of water receives excess nutrients. The abundance of nutrients can cause an overgrowth of algae and deplete the water of oxygen. We are almost done with the chemistry, but we need to discuss one more element before we move on to discuss the biosphere, and that's sulfur. Sulfur. The last biogeochemical cycle we'll be talking about is the sulfur cycle. Sulfur is one of the components that make a protein and vitamins, so plants and animals both need sulfur in their diets. Plants absorb sulfur when it's dissolved in water, so they can take it up through their roots when it's dissolved in groundwater. Animals obtain sulfur by consuming plants. Most of Earth's surface sulfur is tied up in rocks and salts buried deep in the ocean in oceanic sediments. But some sulfur can be found in the atmosphere. The natural ways that sulfur enters the atmosphere are through volcanic eruptions, certain bacterial functions, decomposition in estuaries, and the decay of once living organisms. When sulfur enters the atmosphere through human activity, it's mainly via industrial process that produces sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide gases. We'll talk more about sulfur and how it contributes to air pollution in Chapter 9. Alright, it's time to move on to our discussion of the biotic compounds of Earth. Let's start with a review of how energy moves through the ecosystems. The world's ecosystems. Because different geographic areas on Earth differ so much in their abiotic and biotic components, we can easily place them in broad categories. The two largest categories are broken down in this way. Ecosystems that are based on land are called biomes, while those in aqueous environments are known as aquatic life zones. Aquatic ecosystems are categorized primarily by the salinity of their water. Freshwater and saltwater ecosystems fall into separate categories. Land environments are separated into biomes based on their climate. Remember, temperature and precipitation. Although it might seem that each biome listed in the table on the following page is very distinct, in reality, biomes blend into each other. They do not have distinct boundaries. The transitional area where two ecosystems meet actually has a name. Those are called ecotones. And another important term that you should be familiar with for the exam is ecozones. Ecozones are smaller regions within ecosystems that share similar physical properties. You are then greeted with a chart that shows the different types of ecosystems. Not surprisingly, each biome has specific characteristics that determine the type of organisms that are capable of living in it. Some of these characteristics are the types and availability of nutrients, the ecosystem's temperatures, the availability of water, and how much sunlight the region receives. One important law to be familiar with for the test is the law of tolerance. The law of tolerance describes the degree to which the living organisms are capable of tolerating changes in their environment. Living organisms exhibit a range of tolerance, and even individuals with a population tolerate changes to the environment differently. This concept is the basis for natural selection, which drives evolution. More on this later in the chapter. Another important law for you to know is the law of the minimum, which states that living organisms will continue to live, consuming available materials until the supply of the materials is exhausted. Ecosystem diversity, the term biodiversity, is used to describe the number and variety of ecosystems or organisms found within a specific geographic region or ecosystem. It also refers to the variability among living organisms, including the variability within and between species and within and between ecosystems. Therefore, when we talk about the biodiversity of an area, we must specify the aspects of biodiversity that we're discussing, or else the term is too vague to be comprehensible. In general, however, biodiversity in an ecosystem is a good thing. The more biodiversity in a certain species within an ecosystem, the larger and more diverse the species gene pool, and the greater its chance of adaptation and self-survival. Food chains and food webs. You might recall that non-living components of the environment are known as the abiotic components. These include the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere. Remember them from Chapter 4? Well, it's time to begin our study of the living biotic components of Earth. Together, all of the living things on Earth constitute the biosphere. All living things can be classified by how they obtain food. You might recall that plants and some cyanobacteria are capable of making their own food through photosynthesis, and that some animals, for example mice, eat plants. Some animals, for example humans, can eat both plants and animals, and some animals, for example wolves, eat only other animals. There are actually two fancy terms that are normally used to describe these broad categories for organisms. Autotrophs are those organisms that can produce their own organic compounds from inorganic chemicals, while heterotrophs obtain food energy by consuming other organisms or products created by other organisms. Finally, as unpleasant as it may sound as it might be to think about, some animals feed only on the remains of other plants and animals. All of these different types of living things fall into specific categories, and you will definitely need to memorize all of these terms before the test if you don't already know them. Producers are organisms that are capable of converting radiant energy or chemical energy into carbohydrates. The group of producers includes plants and algae, both of which can carry out photosynthesis. The overall reaction of photosynthesis is shown below. You can just look at that on your own thing. While most producers make food through photosynthesis, a few autotrophs make food from inorganic chemicals and anaerobic without oxygen environments through the process of chemosynthesis. Chemosynthesis is only carried out by a few specialized bacteria called chemotrophs, some of which are found in hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean. This unbalanced reaction is shown below. Once again, you can see it on your own. At this point, let's discuss a few of the other environmental science terms that you'll be required to know for the exam. The net primary productivity, NPP, is the amount of energy that plants pass on to the community of herbivores in an ecosystem. It is calculated by taking the gross primary productivity, which is the amount of sugar that the plants produce in the photosynthesis, and subtracting from it the amount of energy the plants need for growth, maintenance, repair, and productivity. Oh, and reproduction. I don't know why reproductivity. NPP is measured in kilocalories per square meter per year. In other words, the gross primary productivity of an ecosystem is the rate at which the producers are converting solar energy to chemical energy. Perhaps not surprisingly, the net productivity of an ecosystem is a limiting factor for its number of consumers. A limiting factor is a factor that controls the population growth. It can be many things: space, available food, water, and, as mentioned, the net productivity of an ecosystem. Consumers are organisms that must obtain food from secondary sources, for example, by eating plants or animal matter. There are a number of different types of consumers. We've listed them below. Commit these to memories. Primary consumer, this category includes the herbivores, which consume only producers. Secondary consumer, organism that consumes the primary consumer, the secondary consumer. Tertiary consumer is a consumer that consumes the secondary consumer. Detrivores is an organism that, in this group, derive energy from consuming non-living organic matter such as dead animals or fallen leaves. Decomposers, these are organisms that consume dead plants and animal matter. Saprotrophs, these are decomposers that use enzymes to break dead organisms and absorb the nutrients. Note that one organism that may occupy multiple levels of food chain. When you're eating a hamburger with toppings, you are a primary consumer because you're eating tomatoes and lettuce, and a secondary consumer by eating the beef. Let's move on and talk about how energy flows through all of these different types of organisms and ecosystems. Food chains. As you probably recall, energy flows in one direction through ecosystems from the sun to producers, to primary consumers, to secondary consumers, to tertiary consumers. In an ecosystem, each of these feeding levels is referred to as a trophic level. With each successful trophic level, the amount of energy that's available in the next level decreases. In fact, only 10% of the energy from one trophic level is passed on to the next. Most is lost as heat, and some is used for metabolism and anabolism. Interestingly enough, this is why the food chains rarely have more than 4 trophic levels. Food chains are usually represented as a series of steps, in which the bottom is the producer and the top is the secondary or tertiary consumer. In food chains, the arrows depict the transfer of energy through the levels, and in fancier food chains, the relative biomass, the dry weight of the group of organisms of each trophic level, will often be represented. Here's an example of a food chain below. What we're showing here is a typical terrestrial food chain, but keep in mind that there are aquatic food chains as well, with algae and different types of foods. One final note about food chains. In a food chain, only about 90% of the energy is transferred from one level to the next. The other 90% is used for things like respiration, digestion, running away from predators. It's used to power the organism doing the eating. In other words, the producers have the most energy in an ecosystem. The primary consumers have less energy than producers, and the secondary consumers have less energy than the primary consumers, and the tertiary consumers will have the least energy of all. The amount of energy in kilocalories available at each trophic level organized from greatest to least and is an energy pyramid. Biomagnification. Food chains represent the flow of energy in an ecosystem, but the other things can flow through food chains too, including environmental toxins. While the amount of usable energy decreases at every level of the food chain, the concentration of certain toxins increases at each successive level. Since most toxins cannot be broken down by organisms, the term bioaccumulation is used to describe the accumulation of a substance such as a toxic chemical in the tissue of a living organism, such as the producer or primary consumer. Biomagnification is the term used to describe the increasing concentration of these toxin molecules at successively higher level trophic levels in a food chain. Keep in mind that although really any type of molecule could be described by using the term bioaccumulation and biomagnification, generally these terms are used to describe toxins and heavy metals, and certainly this is how they'll be used on tests. PCB accumulation. There's the diagram for food webs, tangled food webs. As you're probably already aware, food chains are an oversimplified way of demonstrating the myriad of feeding relationships that exist in ecosystems. Because there are so many different types of species of plants and animals in an ecosystem, their relationships in a real-world ecosystem are much more complex than that depicted in a single food chain. Therefore, we use a food chain to represent a feeding relationship in ecosystems more realistically. Again, this is a typical food terrestrial food web, but keep in mind that very complicated aquatic food webs exist as well. Let's take a step back for a minute and discuss the setting for food chains and food webs ecosystems. Evolution. Biodiversity in all forms is the result of evolution. Evolution is the change in a population's genetic composition over time. We use a figure called phylogenetic tree to model evolution. Phylogenetic trees can be very broad, like the one on the next page, which encompasses many types of species, or they can be very specific and describe the evolutionary relationships that exist between two species. While you won't need to know much about evolution for this exam, you will need to have a rough idea of how and why it takes place, so we'll run you through that now. Without trying to recreate the evolution of all living organisms, we will limit our discussion to descriptions of how new species are formed. This process is called speciation. Strictly speaking, a species is defined as a group of organisms that are capable of breeding with one another and incapable of breeding with other species. As you may recall, individual organisms that are better adapted for their environments will live and reproduce, ensuring that their genes are parts of the population's next generation. This is what Charles Darwin means by evolutionary fitness. How evolution works. When a habitat and organisms' physical surroundings select certain organisms to live and reproduce and others to die, that population is said to be undergoing natural selection. In natural selection, beneficial characteristics that can be inherited or passed down that can be inherited or passed down to the next generation, and unfavorable characteristics that can be inherited become less common in the population. It is important to remember that natural selection acts upon a whole population, not an individual organism during its lifespan. What changes during evolution is the total genetic makeup of the population, or gene pool, and natural selection is one of the mechanics by which evolution operates. The other way evolution operates is genetic drift. Genetic drift is the accumulation of changes in the frequency of alleles over time due to sampling errors, changes that occur as a result of random chance. For example, in a population of owls, there may be an equal chance of a newly born owlet having long talons or short talons, but due to a random breeding variance, a slightly larger number of long-tailed owlets are born. Over generations, this slight variation can develop into a large trend until the majority of owls in that population have a long talons. These breeding variances can be a result of chance events such as an earthquake that can drastically reduce the size of a nesting population in 1 year. Small populations are more sensitive to the effects of genetic drift than large, diverse populations. When a population displays a small-scale changes over a relatively short period of time, microevolution has occurred. Microevolution refers to the large-scale pattern of evolution within biological organisms over a long period of time. Just as new species are formed by natural selection and genetic drift, other species may become extinct. Extinction occurs when a species cannot adapt quickly enough to the environmental change, and all members of the species die. Biological extinction is the true extinction of a species. There are no individuals left on the planet. Ecological extinction is when there are so few individuals of the species left that this species can no longer perform its ecological functions. Commercial or economic extinction is where a few individuals exist, but the effort needed to relocate and harvest them is not worth the expense. Relationships between species. Let's talk about how species get along together in ecosystems. You probably recall from your biology class that a group of organisms of the same species is called a population. And when a population of different species occupy the same geographic area, they form a community. Every species within a community has an ecological niche. A species niche is described as the total sum of the species use of the biotic and abiotic resources in the environment. That niche describes where the species lives, what it eats, and all the other resources that the species utilizes in an ecosystem. Another term you should know for the exam is habitat. Habitat is the area or environment when an ecosystem or ecological community normally lives or occurs. Some species interact quite a bit with other members of their population. For example, some animals form herds, while others are loners like bears. The reason for these different levels of sociability are largely competition, predation, and general need to exploit the resources in the environment. Competition arises when two individuals of the same species or of two different species are competing for resources in the environment. When the two individuals that are competing are of the same species, this is called intraspecific competition. And when they are of different species, it's called interspecific competition. The resources that are competed for can be food, air, shelter, sunlight, and various other factors necessary for the life. Individuals may be competing to live in a fallen tree, to catch a running rabbit, or to mate with the most desirable female in the population. The competitor who is most fit eventually wins and obtains the resource. That's right, the other is eliminated by competition. One more thing about competition: when two different species in a region compete and the better adapted species wins, this phenomenon is called competitive exclusion. Gauss's principle states that no two species can occupy the same niche at the same time, and that the species that is less fit in the environment will relocate, die out, or occupy a smaller niche. When a species occupies the smaller niche, then it would, in the absence of competition, this compromised niche is called its realization niche. Direct competition can also be avoided in the cause of resource partitioning. This occurs when different species use slightly different parts of the habitat but rely on the same resources. For example, there are 5 species of warblers that can all live in the same pine tree. They can coexist because each species feeds in a different part of the tree, the trunk, at the end of the branches, and at other sites. Alright, moving on. Although it's relatively easy to observe competition between animals, competition between plants is much more subtle and occurs much more slowly. However, if you have a few years to kill, spend some time in your backyard watching the trees and other plants grow. You'll see that they are competing for sunlight and for grounds and other plants to grow. You'll see, they even produce chemicals that inhibit other plants' growth. The second important types of interspecies interactions is predation. Predation occurs when one species feeds on another, and it drives changes in population size. For example, in a year in which rainfall is relatively high in some regions, rabbits have plenty of food. That enables them to reproduce very successfully, and the number of rabbits in the population will increase dramatically. In turn, if the coyote is a predator of the rabbit, coyotes will have plenty of food and their population will also boom. However, in the following year, the rainfall is below average, there will be less grass and the population of rabbits will decline. This will result in a decline in the population of coyotes. As a final note about predation, while it's tempting to think about predation existing only between animals, remember that herbivores prey on plants and zooplankton on phytoplankton. A third type of relationship that exists between organisms is the symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic relationships are close, prolonged association between two or more different organisms of different species that may but do not necessarily benefit each other. There are 3 types of symbiotic relationships, and you should be familiar with all of these types. All of these, for example, in mutualistic symbiotic relationships. Mutualism, both species benefit. For example, this type of relationship exists between sea anemone and clownfish. The clownfish protect the sea anemone from some of its predators, while the stinging cells of the anemone protect the clownfish. The fish also eat some of the detritus left behind when the anemone feeds. In communalistic symbiotic relationships, communalism, one organism benefits while the other is neither help nor hurt. One example of this type of relationship exists between trees and epiphytes. The trees are not affected by the epiphytes growing in them, and the epiphytes benefit by collecting water running down the bark and get better access to sunlight than they would underground. Finally, parasitism is a relationship in which one species is harmed and the other is benefited. For example, the relationship that exists between fleas and dogs. How ecosystems change. Believe it or not, Oftentimes, the biotic balance in a community is maintained by a single species known as the keystone species. The name keystone comes from the last stone placed in an arch bridge, which is the keystone. A keystone species is a species whose very presence contributes to an ecosystem's diversity and whose extinction would consequently lead to the extinction of other forms of life. For example, fig trees are the keystone species in a tropical forest. Likewise, wolves were introduced back into Yellowstone Park because without the wolves to control the number of herbivores, the ecosystem had drastically changed. As a general rule, if the keystone species is removed from an ecosystem, then the ecosystem completely changes. Indicator species are the species that use a standard to evaluate the health of an ecosystem. These are more sensitive to biological changes within their ecosystem than other species, so they're usually an early warning to detect dangerous changes to a community. Trouts are a common indicator species because they are particularly sensitive to pollutants in water. The disappearance of trouts from a particular habitat is a warning that the habitat is becoming polluted. Indigenous species are those that originate and live or occur naturally in an area or environment. With increasing frequency, however, new species are being introduced into ecosystems by chance, by accident, or with intention. While some introduced species cannot find a niche and die out, many others are quite happy in their new environments and compete successfully with the indigenous plants. One example of this is the gray squirrel, which was introduced to England in 1876. The gray squirrel competed with England's native species of squirrels, the red squirrel, and today there are fewer than 30,000 red squirrels alive in England. Another example of the harm that introduced species can do was seen in 1904. A fungus was accidentally introduced into a deciduous forest in the eastern United States. The fungus caused a blight that killed nearly all the chestnut trees by the early 1950s. Although some people don't like to use the term invasive species because they feel that it's derogatory, it is often used to describe introduced species. The two other examples of invasive species are zebra mussels, which were introduced into the Great Lakes when ships dumped ballast water into the lakes, and then quickly grew vine kudzu, and the quickly growing vine kudzu, which was originally introduced into the southeastern United States in order to control the problem of erosion. I'm sorry, guys, if I'm feeling really tired. I'm just feeling really tired right now. Ecological succession. Communities are not static. They are constantly changing. Species of plants and animals are continually coming and going, evolving and dying out. Some of the changes that take place in a geographic area are predictable ones that can be described as ecological succession. If ecological succession begins in a virtually lifeless area, such as the area below or shearing glacier, it is called primary succession. Secondary succession is ecological succession that takes place where an existing community has been declared. The organism in the first stage of either type of succession are referred to as pioneer species and typically had a wide range of environmental tolerance. The community in each stage of succession drives the environmental changes that will allow the next stage to take over. The final stage of succession in which there is a dynamic balance between the abiotic and biotic components in a community is referred to as a climax community. How does a new habitat full of Blair rocks eventually turn into a forest? The first stage of the job usually falls to a community of lichens. Lichens are hardy organisms. They can invade an area, land on bare rocks, and erode the rock surface, and over time turn them into soil. Lichens are pioneer organisms. Once lichens have made an area more habitable, other organisms can settle in. Lichens are replaceable by mosses and ferns, which in turn are replaced by tough grass, and then low shrubs, then conifers, then short-lived hardwood trees such as dogwood and red maple trees, and finally long-lived hardwood trees. Refer to the flowchart of ecological succession from a deciduous forest. Note that the stages are classified by the major new plant group, but remember that with the introduction of each new plant species comes an array of different animal species that prey upon it. We're almost done with this chapter, but you need to know a few more terms and concepts before you can move on to the population chapter. The following material will almost certainly be asked about on the test. when the size of an organism's natural habitat is reduced, or when, for example, a development occurs that isolates the habitat. This process is called habitat fragmentation. Habitat fragmentation can be quite damaging, as you know. Ecosystems are not isolated; they abut each other and meet at wide and overlapping boundaries called ecozones. At these boundaries, there is a great species diversity and biological density there is in the heart of ecological communities, and this is called the edge effect. Some species can only live on the edge of certain habitats, and if the boundaries of a habitat are changed, the new edge is created, damaging both the edge and interior habitat. The theory of island biogeography was first developed to address species diversity on actual islands, but has since been extended to apply to habitable areas that are surrounded by uninhabitable areas. According to the theory, the number of species found on an undistributed island is determined by two factors: immigration and extinction. Woo, you're done with this chapter. Before moving on to the next chapter, answer all the questions on the following drill, and don't forget to use the technique. You can go and do that by yourself, guys. Alright. See you on the next one, probably. And this is the end.